What happens when wealth meets wisdom on the streets? Join us for a three-part journey that challenges perceptions, reveals harsh truths about our society, and ultimately asks, what truly matters in a community? Stay with us as we uncover how one man's experiment transformed not just a town, but the hearts within it. Maxwell Harrington stood in his penthouse bathroom, studying his reflection as his personal stylist applied the finishing touches to his transformation. The man in the mirror was unrecognizable, weathered skin, unkempt gray beard, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of countless hardships. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Harrington?" asked Thomas, his chief of staff, hovering anxiously nearby. "More certain than I've been about anything in years," Maxwell replied, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was about to undertake. At 62, Maxwell had amassed a fortune that placed him among the world's elite. His technology empire, Harrington Innovations, was valued at over $30 billion. His face regularly appeared on magazine covers. His name was synonymous with success. Yet something had been gnawing at him since his wife Eleanor's passing 3 years ago. "People treat you differently when they know you have money," she had told him once. "They don't see you anymore just what you represent." Those words had haunted him, especially as he walked through Millfield, the small town where he'd purchased a vacation property. The same town where he'd grown up poor, left at 18, and returned decades later as its wealthiest visitor. The same town that was slowly dying as businesses closed and young people fled for opportunities elsewhere. When the mayor and town council had practically prostrated themselves before him at the last community meeting, Maxwell had felt something break inside him. Their eagerness to please, their transparent hope that he might be their salvation. It fell hollow. He needed to know the truth about Millfield and its people. "Remember," Thomas instructed, handing Maxwell a battered backpack containing only the essentials, a change of clothes, $20 in small bills, and a prepaid phone. "The team will be monitoring from a distance. If you need anything—" "I won't," Maxwell interrupted. That would defeat the purpose. 7 days as a homeless man in Millfield. No special treatment. That was our agreement. Thomas nodded reluctantly. "And on day 8, we proceed with the property acquisitions, regardless of what happens." "That depends entirely on what I learn," Maxwell answered cryptically. The drive to Millfield took just over an hour. The driver dropped Maxwell off at the edge of town, near the old railroad tracks, with final instructions to contact a security team only in case of emergency. As the luxury car disappeared around the bend, Maxwell took his first steps into a reality he had left behind decades ago. Millfield had once been a thriving community built around the lumber industry. Now, its main street featured more vacant storefronts than businesses. The lumber mill had closed 15 years ago, leaving economic devastation in its wake. What remained was a community hanging on by threads of shared history and stubborn pride. Maxwell's first stop was Huntington Park, where he knew several homeless individuals gathered. He had researched this thoroughly, though secretly. His security team had mapped the town's layout, noting where people without homes tended to congregate. Now, approaching the park bench where an elderly man sat feeding pigeons, Maxwell felt a strange mixture of nervousness and determination. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, adopting a slight stoop in the weary tone he practiced. The man, Walter, he would later learn, merely shrugged and moved over. They sat in silence for several minutes before Walter offered him a piece of bread. "New in town?" Walter finally asked. "Just passing through," Maxwell replied, using the story he had prepared. "Lost my job in Westridge when the factory closed. Thought there might be work here." Walter chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "You picked the wrong place, friend. Millfield's been dying for years. Most folks here can barely keep themselves afloat." Over the next few hours, Walter introduced Maxwell to the invisible community of Millfield, the dozen or so individuals who existed on the margins, sleeping in the park or the abandoned railway station, relying on the community kitchen at St. Matthew's Church, and occasional odd jobs for survival. That night, as Maxwell settled onto a hard bench with his backpack as a pillow, the reality of the situation sank in. The physical discomfort was one thing. He had expected that. What he hadn't anticipated was the way people looked through him as they passed, as if he were already a ghost. The following morning brought Maxwell's first encounter with a wider community. He waited in line at Dixon's diner, clutching a few dollar bills for coffee, when he recognized Councilman Peterson at a corner table, the same man who had enthusiastically endorsed Maxwell's potential investment in the town just weeks earlier. "Excuse me," Maxwell said, approaching the table. "I'm looking for work. Anything available around town?" Peterson barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Town's unemployment office is on Cedar Street. They might help. Can't do anything for you myself." Maxwell nodded and turned away, noting how different this interaction was from their previous meeting, where Peterson had laughed uproariously at his mildest jokes and offered his personal cell number should Mr. Harrington need anything at all. By day 3, Maxwell had established a routine. Mornings at the community kitchen, where volunteers served breakfast with varying degrees of compassion. Afternoons looking for odd jobs or collecting recyclables for small change. Evenings listening to the stories of his new companions. It was at the community kitchen that Maxwell met Sarah Jenkins, a social worker who coordinated the volunteer program. Unlike most others, Sarah looked each person in the eye as she served them, addressing them by name when she knew it, offering the same warm smile to everyone regardless of appearance or circumstance. "You're new," she said when Maxwell reached the front of the line. "I'm Sarah." "Max," he replied, using the shortened version of his name that no one in his business life ever used. "Welcome, Max. There's plenty if you want seconds today." That simple interaction, being seen, being treated with basic human dignity, affected Maxwell more profoundly than he had expected. He found himself returning each day, not just for the food, but for that moment of normal human connection. On day 4, Maxwell witnessed an incident that would ultimately shape his decisions. A local shop owner was berating Walter for loitering outside a store, threatening to call the police. Maxwell watched as Walter, a Vietnam veteran who had shared stories of his service just the night before, hung his head and shuffled away without protest. "It wasn't always like this," Clara, another regular at the community kitchen, told Maxwell later. "Millfield used to look after its own. Then the mill closed, and everyone got scared about their own survival. Fear changes people." As Maxwell walked through town that afternoon, he passed a building he recognized from his property portfolio review, the old Millfield Community Center, closed for over a decade due to lack of funding. Through grimy windows, he could see the abandoned basketball court, the stage where community plays had once been performed, the kitchen where community dinners had brought people together. That night, lying awake on his bench, Maxwell began to formulate a plan, one that went beyond his original intention of simply understanding the town from a different perspective. By morning, he was certain of what needed to be done, though the full scope of his vision remained fluid, contingent on what he would learn in the remaining days of his experiment. What Maxwell didn't realize was that his true education in Millfield was just beginning, and that the lessons he would learn in the coming days would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth worth and the true measure of a community's health. By day 5, Maxwell had become an invisible fixture in Millfield. The locals who frequented Main Street had grown accustomed to his presence, some offering small nods of recognition, others continuing to avoid eye contact entirely. This invisible existence provided Maxwell with unfiltered access to conversations never meant for billionaire ears. Outside the Millfield Savings and Loan, Maxwell overheard board chairman Richard Dolan discussing property foreclosures with a bank manager. "The Henderson place goes up next month," Dolan said, his voice carrying across the sidewalk. "Prime location. Once we consolidate those parcels near the old mill, we can approach those developers from the city. Millfield needs new blood, not nostalgia." Maxwell recognized the strategy. He'd employed similar tactics in his early business days. Buy distressed properties, consolidate, flip to developers. The difference was he'd never witnessed firsthand what happened to people left behind. That afternoon, Maxwell sat in the public library, one of the few places where someone like him could exist without being asked to leave. At a nearby table, 3 teenagers huddled over textbooks. "My dad says we'll probably move next year," one boy said quietly. "There's nothing left here for us." "Where will you go?" asked his friend. "Wherever there's work, I guess. Dad's been on partial hours at the warehouse since January." Maxwell watched their faces. Too young for such worry, yet carrying the weight of their family's uncertainties. He thought of his own childhood in Millfield, how the community had rallied when his mother fell ill, how neighbors brought casseroles and took turns driving him to school. That Millfield felt worlds away from this one. Later, at the community kitchen, Maxwell found himself seated across from Sarah Jenkins again. She'd recognize him immediately, greeting him with that same genuine smile that seemed increasingly rare in Millfield. "How are you finding town?" she asked, sitting down with her own tray after serving was complete. "It's seen better days," Maxwell replied cautiously. Sarah nodded. This was once a place where everyone knew everyone. Now we're just a collection of strangers sharing geography. "What happened?" Maxwell asked, though he knew much of the economic history. "The easy answer is the mill closed," Sarah said, stirring her soup thoughtfully. "But that's not the whole story. Something in our community fabric tore. When times got tough, instead of pulling together, we started seeing each other as competition for what little remained." Her words resonated with Maxwell's observations. The town still had its wealth. It was just concentrated in fewer hands. The community institutions that had once bound people together, the community center, the local newspaper, the annual festivals, had disappeared one by one. "There are rumors," Sarah continued, lowering her voice, "that some billionaire has been buying properties around town. The mayor's practically walking on air about it. Thinks it's our salvation. But I've seen these stories play out before. Wealthy outsiders don't invest in struggling towns unless there's profit to be made." Maxwell felt a strange tightness in his chest. Maybe this investor has good intentions? Sarah's laugh held no mirth. "Intentions pave roads to interesting places, Max. What matters is understanding the real lives affected by big decisions. Take this kitchen. We feed 40 people daily now, up from 15 last year. Each one has a story, dignity, potential. But when towns become investment opportunities, people become abstractions." That night, unable to sleep on his bench despite 5 days of acclimatization, Maxwell walked the empty streets of Millfield. He passed Eleanor's favorite antique shop, now shuttered, the corner where they'd shared ice cream during his first visit back after making his fortune. The elementary school he'd attended, its playground equipment now rusted and sagging. Near midnight, he found himself outside the old mill, the massive structure that had once been Millfield's beating heart. In the moonlight, its skeletal frame looked both haunting and majestic. Through a broken window, Maxwell slipped inside, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The mill still held ghosts of its former life. Massive machinery frozen in time, dust-covered workstations where generations of Millfield residents had earned livelihoods. Maxwell remembered his grandfather's stories of this place, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the community forged in shared labor. Would bulldozing this and building luxury condos really save Millfield? He wondered aloud, his voice swallowed by the emptiness. Day 6 brought Maxwell's first genuinely dangerous moment. Sitting in the park sharing a meager lunch with Walter, they were approached by 3 young men, their expressions hostile. "You two need to clear out," the tallest one demanded. "This park is for decent folks." Walter began gathering his things immediately, but Maxwell remained seated. "It's a public park," he said evenly. The young man stepped closer. "You think anyone wants to see you bums while they're trying to enjoy themselves? You're bringing down property values just by existing." "Tommy," Walter said quietly, "leave it be. Let's go." But Maxwell met the young man's gaze steadily. "What's your name?" he asked. Taken aback by the direct question, the young man answered reflexively, "Jason. Jason, I understand your frustration. This town's struggling. But directing that anger at people who have even less isn't the solution. What do you know about solutions?" Jason scoffed. "You're just another deadbeat." "Perhaps," Maxwell replied calmly. "Or perhaps appearances can be deceiving." Something in Maxwell's demeanor gave Jason pause. After an uncomfortable moment, he muttered to his friends and they moved on, though not without a parting threat to call the police next time. "You shouldn't antagonize them," Walter said once they were alone. "They're just scared kids. Their futures disappeared along with their parents' jobs." Maxwell nodded. understanding flowing through him. Fear and uncertainty were transforming Millfield's youth just as surely as economic hardship was reshaping its landscape. Each person he'd met, from Councilman Peterson to Jason, was responding to the same underlying anxiety. What happens when the foundation of everything you know crumbles beneath you? That evening, Maxwell witnessed the most profound example of Millfield's dichotomy. A town council meeting was being held in the library's community room. Open to the public, Maxwell sat in the back corner, his homeless appearance ensuring no one would approach him. The meeting's main agenda item, discussing preliminary plans for revitalization of the downtown area. Mayor Francis Wilson spoke enthusiastically about potential investment from an interested party of significant means, a thinly veiled reference to Maxwell himself. This could transform Millfield, Wilson declared. New businesses, new housing, new beginning. From his corner, Maxwell watched the room divide before his eyes. The business owners and property holders nodded enthusiastically. The ordinary citizens, teachers, warehouse workers, service employees, exchanged uncertain glances. When public comments opened, Sarah Jenkins rose to speak. "Before we rush to sell off pieces of our town," she said, her voice clear and steady, "shouldn't we ask what kind of community we want to be? Development that displaces current residents isn't revitalization. It's replacement." Councilman Peterson dismissed her concerns. "Ms. Jenkins, with all due respect, your bleeding heart won't keep this town alive. We need investment, plain and simple. And what happens to families who can't afford rising rents when property values increase?" Sarah challenged. "What happens to local businesses when commercial rates triple? Who exactly is being revitalized here?" The room erupted into heated debate. Maxwell observed silently, seeing in this microcosm all the tensions he'd witnessed throughout the week. Two Millfields existed simultaneously, one desperate for economic growth at any cost, another fighting to preserve community bonds despite financial struggles. After the meeting, Maxwell followed Sarah as she walked briskly away from the library, clearly upset. "That was brave," he said, falling into step beside her. Sarah glanced at him, surprised to find him there. It was pointless. They've already decided. Money talks louder than community concerns. "Maybe not," Maxwell replied. "Maybe someone was listening who could make a difference." She gave him a curious look. "You sound different tonight, Max." "Perspective shifts when you really see things," he answered enigmatically. They walked in silence for several blocks before Sarah spoke again. "I've dedicated my life to this town, not because it's perfect, but because every person here matters. When decisions are made purely for profit, humanity gets lost in the equation." As they reached the corner where they would part ways, Sarah hesitated. "There's a community breakfast tomorrow at St. Matthew's. If you're interested." Maxwell nodded. "I'll be there." Back at his bench for his final night outdoors, Maxwell made 2 phone calls from his prepaid phone. One to Thomas, confirming their meeting the following afternoon, and another that lasted nearly an hour, as he outlined a radically different vision than the one they had originally planned. On the morning of Day 7, Maxwell attended the community breakfast at St. Matthew's Church. The gathering was unlike anything he'd witnessed at Millfield's upscale establishments. Here, bankers sat beside mechanics, teachers alongside retail clerks, and, most strikingly, no one questioned the presence of Walter, Clara, or the other homeless individuals Maxwell had come to know. "This is what community looks like," Sarah remarked, joining him with coffee. "No pretense, no hierarchy, just people breaking bread together." Maxwell looked around the room with new eyes. "It's beautiful. It's also increasingly rare," Sarah sighed. "These connections, they're what make a town worth fighting for, not property values or development potential." As they spoke, Maxwell noticed Jason, the young man from the park, serving breakfast alongside an elderly woman. Catching Maxwell's surprised expression, Sarah explained, "Community service for vandalism charges." But Mrs. Abernathy refused to press charges if he agreed to volunteer instead. She taught him in 3rd grade and said he was too bright to waste on stupidity. Maxwell watched the unlikely pair working together, witnessing the transformative power of connection across generational divides. In that moment, the final piece of his plan clicked into place. As the breakfast wound down, Maxwell excused himself. "Thank you, Sarah, for the conversation and for seeing people when others don't." She smiled, though her eyes held curiosity about his formal tone. "Will I see you around, Max?" "Definitely," he replied, "though I might look a bit different next time." With that cryptic statement, Maxwell Harrington walked out of St. Matthew's Church and toward the hotel where Thomas waited with change of clothes, a hot shower, and the resources to set in motion a plan that would shock Millfield to its core. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as a sleek black car pulled up in front of the Millfield Grand Hotel, a once majestic building now showing signs of neglect. From it emerged a clean-shaven Maxwell Harrington, dressed in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. Gone was every trace of the homeless man who had slept on park benches for the past week. Within hours, word spread through town like wildfire. Maxwell Harrington, tech mogul, billionaire, one of the richest men in the country, was not only in Millfield, but had reportedly called an emergency town meeting for that evening at the high school gymnasium. "I don't understand," Mayor Wilson said, pacing the hotel suite where Maxwell had summoned her and the town council. "You've been here all week? Watching us." "Not watching," Maxwell corrected gently. "Living among you. Learning." Councilman Peterson's face had blanched upon recognizing the man he'd dismissed days earlier. "Mr. Harrington, had I known—" "That's precisely the point," Maxwell interrupted. "You didn't know, and so I saw the true Millfield, both its wounds and its wonders." As evening approached, the gymnasium filled beyond capacity. Teachers sat beside their students' parents, shop owners next to their customers. The air hummed with speculation. At precisely 7 o'clock, Maxwell walked onto the stage, accompanied by Thomas and a team of associates carrying presentation materials. "Thank you all for coming," Maxwell began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "Many of you have heard that I've purchased significant properties in Millfield over the past months. Tonight, I want to explain why and what happens next." A projector illuminated the wall behind him, showing a map of Millfield with numerous properties highlighted in red. The Mill, the shuttered community center, dozens of commercial buildings downtown, foreclosed homes, vacant lots. These properties now belong to the newly established Millfield Community Trust. Maxwell continued. "Not to me personally, not to Harrington Innovations, but to a self-sustaining entity whose sole purpose is the revitalization of this community, on the community's terms." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maxwell raised his hand for silence. "Before I share the details, I want to tell you why I'm doing this. I grew up poor in this town. When my mother fell ill, this community carried us. Mrs. Abernathy," he nodded toward the elderly woman who'd been at the church breakfast, "brought us meals every Wednesday. Mr. Cooper let me work odd jobs at his hardware store after school. When I left at 18, I carried that sense of community with me, though I didn't recognize its value until much later." Maxwell paused, his gaze sweeping across familiar and unfamiliar faces alike. "This past week, I've experienced Millfield from a different perspective. As someone with nothing, I've seen how this town treats its most vulnerable citizens. I've witnessed both cruelty and kindness, apathy and profound compassion. Most importantly, I've seen that the true wealth of Millfield has never been in its buildings or businesses, but in the connections between its people." From his position at the back of the gymnasium, Maxwell could see Sarah Jenkins, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization as she recognized Max beneath the tailored suit. Beside her sat Walter, Clara, and others from the community kitchen, people who would normally never attend such gatherings but had been personally invited by Maxwell's team. "The Millfield Community Trust has 3 guiding principles," Maxwell continued. "First, development must benefit current residents, not displace them. Second, economic growth must strengthen community bonds, not sever them. Third, every initiative must address the needs of all community members, especially those most vulnerable." The presentation screen changed to show architectural renderings of a renovated mill complex. The mill will be transformed into a multi-use facility, manufacturing space for small businesses on the ground floor, affordable housing units above, and community spaces throughout. Local contractors will be hired for the renovation, creating immediate jobs. More images appeared. The community center restored, Main Street revitalized but with historic character preserved, the park enhanced with new facilities. But buildings alone don't make a community, Maxwell said, his voice softening, which is why half of the trust resources will fund human infrastructure, expanded social services, educational opportunities, healthcare access, and microloan programs for local entrepreneurs. Maxwell motioned toward Thomas, who distributed folders to key community members, not just the mayor and council, but also Sarah, school principals, church leaders, and even Walter, who accepted his folder with trembling hands. These folders contain invitations to serve on the Trust Governance Board. Because I don't want to be the one making decisions for Millfield. I want Millfield deciding for itself. The gymnasium erupted in murmurs again, louder this time, as people processed the magnitude of what was being proposed. Mayor Wilson stood up. Mr. Harrington, this is unprecedented. The scale of investment you're describing, it must be tens of millions. 150 million, to be exact, Maxwell replied calmly, with another 100 million in an endowment to ensure sustainability. A collective gasp echoed through space. But money isn't what Millfield needs most, Maxwell continued. What I witnessed this week was a community that's forgotten how to be a community. People living side by side, but not seeing each other. That's why every project funded by the Trust will require collaborative effort, bringing together diverse stakeholders who might otherwise never interact. Maxwell stepped away from the podium, moving to the edge of the stage to eliminate the distance between himself and the townspeople. I want to address something directly. Some of you treated me with disdain when you thought I was homeless. Others showed me basic human dignity, regardless of my appearance. I'm not here to shame anyone. We all have blind spots. But I am asking you to recognize that a community is only as strong as how it treats its most vulnerable members. From the audience, a voice called out, "Jason, the young man from the park. Why should we believe you're not just using us for some PR stunt?" Maxwell nodded, acknowledging the valid question. You shouldn't, not based on words alone. Judge the trust by its actions over time. I'm not asking for gratitude or praise. I'm inviting partnership. He turned to a specific section of seats where the high school students sat together. You are Millfield's future. Many of you plan to leave after graduation because you see no opportunities here. The Trust will establish a scholarship program for any Millfield graduate, whether for college, trade school, or entrepreneurial ventures. The only requirement is a commitment to bring that knowledge back to benefit your hometown, even if only temporarily. For the next hour, Maxwell outlined specific initiatives: a community health clinic, a technology training center, affordable housing protections, environmental restoration projects for the river that had once powered the mill. Each proposal addressed needs that had been expressed during his week of listening. Throughout his presentation, Maxwell continually redirected attention away from himself and toward the community members who would make these visions reality. He invited Sarah Jenkins to speak about social service needs, called on Walter to share insights about veteran support programs, asked local business owners to discuss Main Street's potential. This isn't charity, Maxwell emphasized as the presentation neared its conclusion. It's investment in human potential, in community wisdom, in the idea that prosperity should be measured not just in dollars, but in dignity. Each project will be structured for sustainability, with clear metrics for success that go beyond financial returns. As the formal presentation ended and people broke into discussion groups to examine specific proposals, Maxwell made his way through the crowd. He approached Sarah first. "So, not just Max after all," she said, a mixture of emotions playing across her face. "I'm still the person you shared coffee with," he replied, "just with resources to help make your vision for Millfield possible." Sarah studied him carefully. Did our conversations influence this plan? "Profoundly," Maxwell admitted. "You helped me see what I was missing, that revitalization without preserving community connections would be meaningless." Later, Maxwell found himself face to face with Jason, the young man who had confronted him in the park. "I threatened a billionaire," Jason said, looking simultaneously mortified and defiant. "No," Maxwell corrected. "You confronted someone you perceived as threatening your community's image. The question is, what will you do now that you understand the fuller picture? Jason hesitated before answering. My dad worked at the mill before it closed. He's never been the same since. If there's really going to be jobs again, there will be, Maxwell assured him. But more importantly, there will be purpose, the chance to build something meaningful. Would you be interested in joining the Youth Advisory Committee? We need perspectives like yours. As the evening progressed, Maxwell observed the gymnasium transforming, not physically, but in the quality of interactions unfolding within it. People who normally existed in separate spheres were engaged in animated conversations. The invisible barriers of class, circumstance, and status hadn't disappeared, but they had momentarily become permeable. Near midnight, as the last community members departed with their folders of information and schedules of upcoming planning meetings, Maxwell found himself alone in a gymnasium with Thomas. Was it worth it? Thomas asked, "You're weak as a homeless man?" Maxwell gazed the empty space, envisioning not just the renovated buildings his money would create, but the renewed connections his experience had helped him understand were necessary. I came to Millfield thinking I could save it with my wealth, Maxwell said quietly. I left understanding that true revitalization isn't something you can buy. It has to grow from within, from restored relationships and rediscovered dignity. All my millions can do is create space for that process to unfold. Through the gymnasium windows, Maxwell could see people still gathered in the parking lot, not rushing home, but lingering, talking, connecting. Mayor Wilson deep in conversation with Walter, Sarah introducing Clara to the high school principal, Jason helping Mrs. Abernathy to her car. Eleanor was right, Maxwell murmured, thinking of his late wife. People treat you differently when they know you have money. They stop seeing you. But the reverse is also true. Wealth can blind you to seeing others clearly. In the months that followed, Millfield underwent a transformation that made national headlines, not just the scale of investment or the innovative community-led development model, but for the process itself. Weekly town halls became standing-room-only events. Volunteer committees formed to address specific needs. People who had lived as strangers for years discovered common purpose. The mill renovation broke ground 6 months later. Not with traditional ceremony where dignitaries wielded symbolic shovels, but with community celebration where every resident was invited to add a handful of earth to the foundation, symbolizing their shared investment in Millfield's future. Maxwell Harrington maintained his connection to the town, but steadfastly refused to dominate its rebirth. He purchased a modest home on Elm Street, the same street where he'd grown up, and could often be found at community events, not as a celebrated benefactor, but as a neighbor among neighbors. The Millfield Community Trust became a model studied by struggling towns across the country. Journalists wrote about the Millfield miracle. Economic experts analyzed the trust structure. Social scientists documented the restoration of community bonds. But for the people of Millfield, the most profound change wasn't captured in any headline or case study. It was in a gradual reshaping of how they saw themselves and each other, the restoration of a community fabric that had been fraying for decades. 1 year after his week of homelessness, Maxwell stood on the banks of the Millfield River, watching a community festival unfold in the park that had once been his bedroom. Children played on new equipment, while their parents chatted on benches. Vendors, many supported by the Trust's microloan program, sold crafts and food. On the restored bandstand, a local music group performed. Sarah Jenkins joined him, following his gaze across the scene. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving so much away?" Maxwell shook his head. "I haven't given anything away. I've simply redistributed resources to where they can create the most value, not just economic value, but human value." They watched as Walter led a group of veterans in raising a flag at the newly established Veteran Support Center, a man who had been invisible a year earlier, now standing tall with restored purpose and dignity. The true transformation of Millfield isn't in its buildings, Maxwell reflected. It's in moments like this, when people recognize themselves in each other across all the artificial divides we create. As they walked toward the festival, Maxwell remembered his nights on the park bench, the cold seeping through his clothes, the experience of being unseen. That perspective had forever altered his understanding of wealth, community, and the true measure of a life well lived. The disguise taught me what money couldn't buy, Maxwell said quietly, and what, in the end, matters most. Together, they joined the celebration, not as billionaire and social worker, but as two threads in the rewoven fabric of a community remembered itself into wholeness.